The eyes of the world have been increasingly fixed on the United Nations, focused on the drama of confrontation as the Security Council stepped in, showing us the gravity of a world organization committed to peace, voting to permit war. That was the scenario late in 1990 after Iraq invaded Kuwait, and after Iraqi leaders ignored a Security Council resolution which imposed a deadline for withdrawal.
Mr. Ambassador?
This is a house of peace. It's not the house of war. And we hope and pray that there will be a diplomatic political solution. But if there isn't, I think it's important for the international community to say to Baghdad, look, we're serious. You have to leave Kuwait.
This is the story of an organization at a turning point. Whereas once the United Nations was trapped in the Cold War quagmire, now it seems to be galvanized.
The UN is not a group of judges or neutral observers or umpires in a baseball game. The UN is made up of countries. They're very political, and countries have interests, and some countries they like better than others. And as you know, it's easier to criticize your enemies than it is your friends. But sometimes you do a bigger favor when you criticize your friends.
He called it naked intervention. Yeah, exactly. In internal Iraqi affairs. You want some more?
The UN plays host to some 1,700 correspondents and 150 news organizations from member countries. They keep the world's eyes focused on a new level of power politics at the UN.
Within this piece.
Instantly?
They asked for it from Baghdad.
Baghdad. Okay, what I enjoy about working here is that I feel I'm at the center of international events. And we've actually seen that through the Gulf War. I mean, really being at the focal point of all that's been going on around us. And I feel I've sort of witnessed history.
The UN has become an exciting assignment. It wasn't always so. 5 years back, it was hard to pick up the phone and interest any editor on a story out of the UN. The UN was synonymous with boredom. Ed Koch called it a cesspool. But now, the UN is the center of the universe. As long as the superpowers are cooperating the way they are, and they have been for the past 2-3 years, and making this organization work, this place is going to be a fairly important player on the international scene.
We really passed. That's what we have in mind with this resolution.
The United Nations Association of the United States works to promote the UN in schools through publications and model UNs. Senior Vice President Toby Gotti.
When most Americans think about the United Nations, they think of the Security Council, the place you go to when there's a crisis or there's a war. But the UN is really much more than that. And for the rest of the world, what's very, very important, and we don't often think about, is the development work of the UN.
The United Nations is among the largest and most intensive human endeavors in the history of the world. It involves every nation on Earth. Its purpose is peace and the development of peoples. Peace is not the opposite of war. Peace is a very turbulent condition, and the UN is right at the center of it. Let's take a few minutes and explore this very special place. You might find that there's more here than you think. President Woodrow Wilson's vision of a League of Nations evolved in the aftermath of World War I. 20 years later, the world suffered its second Great War, and Wilson's concept was reshaped. In 1945, during the final days of World War II, 50 countries met in San Francisco to sign the UN Charter. These were the first words.
We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind.
The UN's first home was London's Church House. Headquarters have moved several times since then. And now the United Nations has representatives in all 159 member nations. Offices in Nairobi, where the United Nations Environmental Program has its headquarters. In Vienna, home of the United Nations Industrial Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Commission on Human Rights is in Geneva. And the International Court of Justice is located at The Hague. But headquarters are located in a part of New York designated an international zone, where the General Assembly opens each September.
Good morning, Secretary General.
The Secretary General is elected by the General Assembly for a 7-year term. The President of the General Assembly, who presides over meetings, rotates each fall. Speeches and documents are translated into 6 official languages.
Consciente de la longue histoire de
French,
intransigeance, de mensonge et de prévarication.
Chinese,
Господин председатель,
Russian,
я могу откровенно признать, что политика конструктивного...
To observe any hostile or
English,
potentially hostile action
Sus
mounted on
actividades de
territory
subversión y desestabilización de los gobiernos de los estados de la línea del frente.
نقبل الطعن في هذه
Arabic.
الصفات من قبل من وعدناهم بأننا سوف نحميهم.
In the General Assembly, every country has one vote, so in theory, every country is equal. But on the powerful Security Council, whose charge is to maintain world peace and security, 5 permanent members of the Council's 15 have veto power, which makes them a bit more equal than other countries.
Whenever there's a crisis, people say, what's the UN role? And that's very new, because in the past, the UN was really paralyzed by the division between the United States and the Soviet Union. If the two of us couldn't agree, since we both had a veto in the Security Council, the UN couldn't do anything.
This Cold War paralysis meant many countries were unwilling to bring their conflicts to the Security Council. Vietnam was one case where the UN never got involved.
It never got involved for one simple reason. As is UN practice, the UN doesn't get involved in a war unless the parties to that war are willing to bring the crisis to the UN. The United States never was willing to bring the Vietnam War to the United Nations. The feeling was in the 1960s that we could handle it by ourselves. Obviously, we didn't do a very good job, but that was the feeling. Things are changing now, and I think that's what gives the UN hope.
When delegates come in here, firstly, they look for where their friends are.
Hello, how are you?
Hi, very well, thank you. China has announced its support, so it looks very good. And this United Nations traditionally has been divided into 5 regional groups. These regional groups are African group, the Latin American and Caribbean group, the Asian group, the Eastern European group, and Western European and others group. And then we have the Group of 77, which are mainly third world countries, developing countries, who deal with the North-South dialogue in the field of economic development.
Papua New Guinea is one of more than 70 nations formerly ruled by a colonial power or held as a trust territory. Most of these countries can thank the United Nations Trusteeship Council for helping to liberate them. With the UN's assistance, Papua New Guinea became an independent nation in 1975. Another island nation, Samoa, became independent from New Zealand with the UN's help.
The United Nations has been a very friendly organization for small countries like mine, Samoa. We have a small population of 160,000, and as most American high school kids have noticed, our major exports are primarily wrestlers and linemen for the National Football League. First of all, the United Nations came in and told us that as a colony, we had a right to be independent. Then the United Nations, through its decolonization system, showed us how to be independent. And then the United Nations negotiated with our former colonial master, enabling us to move to independence in 1962, a long time ago, to independence. And ever since then, we've had democratic changes of government. Regularly, every 3 years, there's an election, and every single change of government has been by democratic means, and there hasn't even been one blood nose.
When the UN was founded, there were only 51 members. In the 1960s, some 70 countries were created on the basis, many of them, of UN resolutions about decolonization. So the first area that the UN was thinking about was protecting the rights of a nation to be born, to be politically independent, to be economically independent.
Another part of the UN system which touches on national sovereignty is the International Court of Justice. Countries can bring disputes here and have them impartially settled. For example, territorial disputes or maritime fishing boundaries. David Sheffer specializes in international law.
The International Court of Justice functions rather well, even though we have political disagreements sometimes with the decisions that it reaches. But the court is not a place where you try individuals, so that's where it is distinguished from American courts. We could not prosecute Saddam Hussein at the World Court, but we can take the Iraqi government to the World Court.
But in fact, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, was brought before the Security Council, which met in emergency session and passed the first of many resolutions designed to bring an end to the aggression. Kuwait's ambassador, Mohammed Abul Hassan.
Since the first hours of the aggression, Security Council has acted spontaneously in a manner that the founding father of the United Nations envisaged.
The result of the voting is as follows: 13 votes in favor.
After Iraq did not heed the first Security Council resolution, which is 660, which calls for a complete withdrawal, an immediate withdrawal, and solving the problem bilaterally, Security Council has taken an action unprecedented in its history to impose a total embargo and sanction on Iraq because of its failure to abide by and comply with Security Council Resolution 660. Then a series of action took place from Security Council which authorized the countries cooperating with the legitimate government of Kuwait to use force to expel and to eject Iraq from Kuwait and to force Iraq to implement and comply with all Security Council resolutions. And it gave to Iraq, as a gest of goodwill, 45 days for this full compliance.
21969, please raise their hand. Got the count? Thank you. Those opposed?
And as you know, unfortunately, Iraq did not heed the international will. And they have not taken the international community and the Security Council seriously. They thought, according to their misgivings, that it is a one-man show, it is a United States show, or it's a United States and certain countries show.
The Gulf conflict was undoubtedly the largest undertaking ever by the United Nations in terms of diplomatic efforts and in terms of military enforcement, in terms of arms control for a particular nation, namely Iraq, in terms of destroying weapons in Iraq, in terms of setting up a large number of activities for the Secretary General to undertake to control the peace and stability in Iraq. And it also just galvanized the United Nations. It galvanized the Security Council. An unprecedented number of resolutions were adopted to enforce international law against Iraq, and that has never been done in the past. It was a seminal event in the history of the United Nations, and there's every reason to hope that it can be repeated again if there is aggression again in the world.
This is all part of the political side of the UN you see on television. But there is another side of the United Nations not often in the headlines. Across the street from the political body, with its flags and diplomats' limousines, are the specialized agencies committed to the development process. With more than $1.25 billion in voluntary contributions from industrialized countries, UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, is the funding agency for much of it. Nessim Shalan, an Egyptian, has spent more than 3 decades with the UN Development Program.
The developing world constitutes nearly 4/5 of the population of the world. And the industrialized countries, the developed countries, which means North America, all of Europe, Japan, and a few other countries, Australia, Canada, those together represent less than 1/5 of the population. Now, that division of population does not reflect the wealth. I think the wealth of the 1/5 of the world that is industrialized and developed is more than 5 times what it would be for the poorer nations. They are far richer. And what the UN does in that regard is to act as an intermediary to transmit some of the knowledge and capacities from the developed world, the industrialized world, to the poorer nations of the world.
These agencies go quietly about the job of immunizing children against disease, building sanitary water and sewer systems, and rebuilding the infrastructure of war-torn nations. The United Nations Industrial Development Organization, for example, teaches developing nations to harness their natural resources and improve technology. In Bali, the UN Development Program has made the role of women in development a priority. Here in the village of Sulang, young women learn a craft traditionally practiced by their elders, a craft that had almost disappeared until a village-level organization received a UNDP grant for hand looms. Some villagers have nearly doubled their family income as a result. In West Africa, UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, is helping the peoples of a once powerful kingdom, Abomey in Benin, rediscover their history and culture. This bas-relief shows an army of 5,000 women warriors who are today celebrated by their descendants. Agencies like UNESCO report to the General Assembly through the Economic and Social Council. Here, matters of social and economic concern, such as drugs or the death penalty, are debated. The United Nations International Children's Education Fund, UNICEF, is among the largest and most visible of these agencies. Jibril Diallo serves as Special Assistant to the Executive Director.
The United Nations Children's Fund is the world body whose mandate is to deal with the survival, protection, and development of the child. And that work is done mainly in developing countries. Out of the 15 million children who die every year around the world, 5 million die in Africa. That means that every 24 hours, 20,000 children are wasted in Africa. This is something which can be reversed, which can be changed. Africa has been declared as the continent of priority for UNICEF for the coming 10 years, because the African continent has got the largest amount of suffering and disruption resulting from drought, famine, and the consequences of civil wars and uprisings. And this is what we try to emphasize, that yes, there is the Security Council that deals with settling of issues like the wars and political issues, but let us try to deal also with issues on population control, on child survival and development, on health issues with the World Health Organization, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Food and Agriculture, and other items of that nature.
Let's take a look at one of these frontline agencies which focuses on issues of basic human survival. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees serves an estimated 15 million people who have fled their homelands fearing persecution. Most refugee work is done on location in the world's trouble spots. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, nearly 5 million civilian refugees fled those two countries. In this case, UNDRO, the UN Disaster Relief Office in Geneva, coordinated the work of UN agencies and volunteers. UNICEF and the World Health Organization handled health, sanitation, and nutrition, with help from the World Food Program. While the UN has been traditionally concerned with human rights and national rights to sovereignty, in the last 20 years, the international community has become concerned about the survival of the planet itself.
The United Nations, very early on, in the early 1970s, was able to mobilize world concern over the issue of the environment at a time when not too many countries, particularly countries in the Third World, were really thinking about environment. And at a conference in 1972, for the first time, countries of the world were able to get together and talk about the issue of environment.
Out of that conference came a body to coordinate information about the environment, the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP. Information about climate change, emission levels, ocean pollution, toxic chemicals and their effects on the environment is UNEP's mandate.
First of all, the United Nations Environment Program is one of the youngest of the agencies, and it's quite small. You know, we have, I think, only 300 or 400 professional people in Nairobi. We have 3 different units. So we have what's called GEMS, Global Environment Monitoring System. We have an Infoterra for information, and we have an international registry for potentially toxic waste. These are all registries where governments and ministries can access for particular information, example, hazardous waste, the effects of chemicals on human beings. We have an extraordinary networking system. We do not cook the information up ourselves, you know, we just have the contacts with the key people and scientists and so on, and which is loaded into our information system.
The UN has an ambitious agenda for the 1990s. Problems concerning drugs, debt, and the environment are near the top. And with more cooperation from the superpowers and more attention from the press, the public is expecting more from it.
What is happening now, and when I came here for the second time after a 10 years break, what I saw is that this organization is moving very quickly, very rapidly towards trying to reach some concrete results in different areas and trying to reach consensus, which means such a decision which is acceptable to everyone.
One expression of this consensus and revival of faith in the United Nations is the willingness of the United States to pay its dues. The United States pays 25% of the UN's budget of about $1 billion a year. This organization, with 159 bosses, has not always impressed U.S. politicians.
The United States government was really essentially quite dissatisfied with the size and functioning of the UN during the early 80s particularly. And it was for that reason in 1985 that President Reagan started withholding a certain amount of our annual contribution to the United Nations in an effort to sort of force the attention of the UN to this important managerial and sort of budgeting issue. In the last 4 years, the UN has looked at this matter very seriously. They've reduced their staff by approximately 15%. And for the last 4 years, we have had what we call zero growth in the budget. That is, there is no growth in any annual budget, and inflation costs are absorbed in the amount. So this represents a significant savings.
There's no question that the United Nations has some bloated characteristics to it and some inefficiencies. And there's an initiative to really deal with those problems at the UN. So I think those problems are going to remedy themselves within a short number of years. But it's very important for the world to have a talk shop. We need a place where we can blow off steam. And what's so encouraging about the United Nations is that it's also a place where problems are starting to be resolved. And the Gulf conflict is the first example of major proportions in that field.
The idea of 159 different nations sitting together in one hall and trying to more or less coordinate their absolutely different points of view and to produce a document or a decision which is which every country is agreeable with. From my point of view, it's a phenomenon in itself. And I would say that the fact that this organization have been functioning since 1945, 1946, keeping in mind the fact that the membership was always growing and that now it is 159 members, it's really something, you know. It's some kind of organization that we have to cherish now, nearly half a century after the moment when it was started.
In the past 2 years, things have changed quite a bit. So you have one crisis after another being resolved. The crisis in Namibia, all of a sudden you have UN election monitors, UN peacekeepers coming in. In the past, you'd have a war and people would say, let's pick up the pieces, let's let the UN come in. Now what we're saying at the UN is, look, if there's going to be a crisis or if there is a problem, why don't we think what the UN role can be during the crisis? And maybe one day we'll even come to the point where we look at the UN and say, help, there's going to be a crisis, let's have the UN come in before there's a war. But we haven't gotten there yet.
My understanding is that if it worked through the very difficult years of the Cold War, most probably it probably will see better times in front of her.
This is a critical period for the UN as it approaches its 50th birthday. The UN should neither be idolized nor demonized, writes Israel's former UN ambassador, Abba Eban. It mirrors today's international system. Its flag rightfully belongs wherever the idea of peace is realistically debated. While the United Nations may be at a turning point in relation to the superpowers, to many developing nations, it has been a friend from the beginning.
The United States or the Soviet Union or India doesn't really need the United Nations to protect them from outside aggression. It's the small countries of the world, the Kuwaits, and other small countries which are easily taken over by powerful neighbors that really need the will of the international community to stand by them and to protect them from the most blatant kind of aggression.
Today's world has become a big village. And when there are troubles in one part of the village, there are bound to be repercussions in the other part of the village. Hence the troubles in Ethiopia, the troubles in Bangladesh, the troubles in Iraq are bound to have repercussions in the United States, in Britain, in France, in Germany, and so on. So that today, no country is an island closed onto itself. Every country is bound to be affected one way or another by what's going on around the world.
If there was no UN, we would not be confident in our feeling of security in our neighborhood throughout the world. But because of the assurances that UN has given for us and the friendliness that has been extended to us, cooperation by all the member countries, we can feel that we are part of the family, this village that we live in now in this planet.
Al 9 апреля 1991 года
aplicar de forma libre su derecho inalienable a la
L'accusation de terrorisme, il a déclaré, et je cite,
سيلزم أن تحظى على الدوام بثقة مجلس الأمن ومساندته وأن تحصل على التعاون اللازم من الأطراف وأن تؤدي عملها.
以防止侵犯边界的情势。3. 观察从一国境内对另一国发动